Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. On behalf of the board and staff at IMFG, I'm delighted to welcome you to the 9th Annual IMFG City Manager's Address. Our session today is entitled, If Not Now, When? A Whole of Government's Approach to Recovery. Our guest speaker is the City Manager for Toronto, Chris Murray. My name is Enid Slack, and I'm the Director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. I realize that everyone is in a different location here in Toronto, elsewhere in Canada, or even somewhere else, but I would like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would just like to start by thanking our external funders at the Institute, Havana Capital, Maytree, the City of Toronto, the region of Halton, and the region of York. I would also like to thank our team at IMFG for putting this event together today, Thomas Hatchard and Ahmed Kawaja. And I'd also like to thank the events staff and the technical staff at the Munk School, specifically Adam Bell and Daria Dimbadze. If you are tweeting about this event, and of course we encourage you to tweet about it, our hashtag is IMFG Talks, and our Twitter handle is @IMFGToronto. As I mentioned, today's presentation is the 9th annual IMFG event with the Toronto City Manager, and the 3rd for Chris Murray. My, how time flies. We hold this event every year so that the City Manager can provide us with an update on what's been happening at the city, as well as enlightening us about future challenges and opportunities. Well, a lot has happened since Chris was here last year. COVID-19 and the response to it have had a huge impact on the city and on its finances. And the future remains uncertain. Today, Chris is going to tell us a bit about what's happened, but he's going to focus on how the city plans to approach the recovery from this pandemic. Our moderator today is Jan De Silva. I think many of you watching know who Jan is, so I won't say too much, except that she is the President and CEO of the Toronto Region Board of Trade, one of the largest and most influential business organizations in North America. Prior to joining the board, Jan served as CEO of Sun Life Financial's Hong Kong and mainland China businesses and co-founded and later sold Retail China Limited. Jan also served as Dean of Ivy Asia for the Ivy Business School at Western University. So in a moment, I'm going to turn this over to Jan. She will make some introductory comments and she will introduce Chris. Chris will then speak for about a half an hour, followed by a moderated discussion with Jan. At the end, there'll be time to answer questions from the audience. So I encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. All these Zoom users are used to this now. Send your questions in at any point during the talk. So let me now welcome and turn it over to Jan De Silva.
Thank you so much, Enid, for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to this important annual event. Congratulations on your 9th City Manager's Address. And Chris, congratulations, 3rd time in a row. So thanks so much for having you here. Hello, everyone. Everyone knows Chris Murray, so I won't spend a lot of time on an introduction other than just to say what an experienced planner he is in transportation and housing. As you know, he became Toronto City Manager in 2018 after serving almost a decade in that role for Hamilton. In fact, it's my duty to apologize to Hamiltonians that we stole him away every time I speak in Hamilton. He's one of the city's, in fact, the region's best known relationship builders, and has a keen ability to listen, learn, and plan around the challenges facing our city and our region. Chris knows how to bring the right people to the table, and that's a crucial skill to have these days. And here's why. Prior to the pandemic, our region was experiencing massive growth. More than 125,000 people were coming to the region each year. We were creating more well-paying jobs in tech and advanced manufacturing than Silicon Valley, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. combined. And as the largest contributor to Canada's economy, responsible for 25% of the country's GDP, the region solidified its status as the tentpole of our future prosperity. While all that growth fueled our economy, it also created real obstacles for our cities, and particularly Toronto, to address. We needed to build infrastructure like housing and transit at a breakneck speed and deliver an increasing number of services to diverse and growing communities. Anything but would put our long-term economic potential at risk and add more pressure to an ever-widening income inequality situation. That was the problem set faced by Chris and the city at the start of this year. And then came the pandemic. Next year, City Hall is expecting a $1.5 billion budget shortfall. To put that in perspective, the TTC alone is projecting an $800 million revenue loss in 2020, which is equivalent to the entire operating budget of the city of Mississauga. But the demands for increased housing, transit, and city services have not disappeared. And any temporary slowdown of newcomers is simply that, temporary. Immigrants, international students, and new workers will return as soon as it is safe. So how does the city serve an expanding population without an expanding budget? The answer, regional coordination, or a whole of government's approach, as Chris calls it. That's where his unique collaborative skills come into play. For example, if Toronto doesn't have to compete for provincial or federal funding with Oshawa, Brampton, Hamilton, or any of the other 34 municipalities in the Innovation Corridor, imagine how much all of us could get done. And if all of those cities have an equal role in guiding investment, programs, and infrastructure, we can focus on what the whole region needs rather than any single one-off project. The future is what we at the board called for in our recent Regional Recovery Playbook, powered by data and analysis from our Economic Blueprints Institute. I want to thank Chris for his leadership participating in that playbook steering committee, as well as helping bringing other city administrators on board to advance the playbook's priority actions over the coming 12 months. As part of a new forum, the board is convening with Chris called the One Corridor Working Committee. Now, this approach sounds simple, but it's really a fundamental shift in the way cities like Toronto relate to each other and other orders of government. These are long-standing issues, but the situation we find ourselves in adds urgency. After all, as Chris has titled this event, if not now, when? And I would add, if not us, then who? There's no better time to make smart, coordinated decisions about our city and our region's growth. To tell you more about how Toronto is going to do just that, it's my pleasure to introduce for his third City Manager's Address, Chris Murray. Chris, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jan, and thank you, Enid, for hosting this event. And thanks again to everyone who's taken the time to stay with us for the next while. I also must recognize the people that put this presentation together, Meg and Beth and Sonali. And as well, I just want to also recognize my senior leadership team of Julie, Tracy, Josie, and Heather. And I think our head of communications is on this event as well, Brad. So I'm sure over the last several weeks and months, we've heard the term, never let a good crisis go to waste. Well, this is certainly a good crisis. And I think we do have an opportunity here to address a number of matters that I would say in the short, medium, long term were challenges that we were facing for the most part. And these challenges really weren't necessarily new, what's happened in the last 8 months is that the magnitude and the uncertainty of these challenges has certainly grown to the point where the focus of this presentation is, if not now, when, and the approach, the how to approach it is what I will describe in the next 30 minutes, the whole of government approach to recovery. So with that, if we can move to the second slide. Oh. Just, there we go, perfect. So for the next short while, I'm going to address really 4 basic themes here. First is the impact of COVID has had on us, and of course our response. And that response, I'll focus in on the immediate response, but also some of the, if you will, the medium to longer term thinking that's going on. I think it's really important that we describe what the economic impact of COVID has been, and do that in both a national and a city perspective. I think it's really important that we also talk about who has been impacted and to what extent. And so I want to focus a bit of time and information on deepening the inequities and talking about who in fact has been impacted. And then, of course, the last being towards recovery, the challenges that lie ahead, and why I think as Canadians, we're uniquely positioned to do some great things. So with that, if we can go to the next slide. So certainly COVID has had a profound effect on everyone around the globe. And certainly the impact that we have felt has been very much on our socioeconomic and cultural context. So we need to lay a foundation for recovery, but recognize the fact that the virus is still with us. And although there is a vaccine on the horizon, we will be dealing with COVID for some time, but maybe even more importantly, the socioeconomic and cultural effects of it for some time. Of course, you know, as we learn to live with it, we know that the inequities have been significant amongst Torontonians. And I think it's really important that whatever strategy we have going forward recognizes who has paid the price and how important it will be for us to focus on the people that have been most directly affected. And then, of course, that the public health remains our priority. Dr. Davila and her team has done a phenomenal job of giving us the best advice and working with the provincial government to try to keep people healthy, try not to overwhelm our healthcare system, but at the same time, respect the livelihoods that people rely on to maintain their quality of life. And of course, the public service, which I'm fiercely proud of. I never started in public service. I worked in consulting, and then I discovered the career that I now have, which is one of trying to earn all of your trust and confidence. And so if we can switch to the next slide. I'm not going to read all of this. I just want to point out a few things. Over the last 8 months, a number of actions have been taken by the city to address not just the public health issues as they unfold, whether it be PPE, the economic response, trying to keep our businesses afloat as they experience a once in a century event. Of course, keeping Toronto moving. You know, we've seen more bike lanes in a short period of time than I think we ever had in our history. And of course, with the TTC trying to keep travel on that system safe. And then modernizing our services. When we shut down City Hall, we had to keep working, of course. And we went from about 1,000 people being able to work from home to almost 10,000 in the span of a few weeks. And as the mayor would describe it, you know, we operate at wartime speed. And of course, the community response, which has been quite profound in everything from shelter system to food banks to how we look after people in long-term care facilities. And I just want to comment on one of the pictures that you have in front of you. There's 4 individuals that you see there. Certainly Dr. Davila, who I think has served this community incredibly well as a top public health professional. And I have the privilege of knowing her, and of course Mayor Tory, who we are, I think, are very fortunate to have him at the helm, leading council and responding to all the issues that our community is facing as the mayor of the city of Toronto. And of course, Councillor Cressy, who's not in the shot, who is the head of the public health or public board of health, you know, is there every step of the way, making sure that the interests of that board are being kept in mind. And of course, Chief Pegg, who oversees our emergency operations center, and Brad, our head of communications. Brad, you know, plays a very important role in making sure that we are as transparent as possible. And I think earning people's trust and confidence is not just his job, it's all of our jobs. So, and then there's the others that you don't see in the picture that have just done phenomenal work, whether it be Marianne looking after our shelter system, or Paul Raptis, who looks after our long-term care, and a whole host of others, which I will not name them all. But as a public servant, as someone as a city manager, I get to be part of this process, and I can't say enough about the people I work with, including the institutions we work with in this community. And so maybe if we go to the next slide, I can talk more about what we've accomplished. So certainly in terms of, you know, and I was saying before this event started that my predecessor, Peter Wallace, talked about the fact that the city financially was heading towards an iceberg. And I would say whatever vehicle that we are in, COVID has sped it up. And we are certainly moving much faster towards that challenge than we were in the past. And the magnitude of this challenge, which Jan, I think, mentioned, and very important, I'll get into the specifics of it in a few slides. You know, the financial challenge is not in the hundreds of millions, it's in the billions. And just to put in perspective, there's no other city in Canada that comes close to the kinds of revenue losses and expenses that the city of Toronto has incurred. And so we are operating, you know, at a financial level of challenge that is unprecedented. And that's not just this year, it's certainly next year. And I believe you'll see more of the challenge extend into the future. So that, along with other matters such as teleworking, as much as there's pluses to it, there are certainly minuses. The effect that it's had on our retail sector, our restaurants, the fact that we don't have as many people coming downtown is a massive challenge. And of course, e-commerce, which again is another one of those things that is unfolded in magnitude, unlike what we've seen in the past. But you know, all of us are shopping online now. And of course, you know, for those retail stores that don't lend themselves well to online shopping, it is creating pressures that are unfathomable. So the idea in the past that somehow City Hall can either spend less, you know, and save money, or do more with less, or just kind of react to this as status quo. I mean, none of those typical responses are going to fix what's in front of us. The reality is that the challenges that we're facing, some of them we can project, some of them are more challenging to project. So we are dealing with uncertainty. And so with that, you know, what the focus of this presentation is really about all governments, all sectors, all communities that are impacted the same by that uncertainty, that there's really a need for us to work together in ways that maybe we haven't in quite some time. But we need time, and we need information, and we need a level of engagement in order to develop and iterate towards this recovery. So the idea that somehow old solutions, somehow that Toronto, by going it alone, is going to be able to address the challenges that I just described, I don't think is possible. And so we'll talk more about why I think the approach that this whole presentation is entitled is so important. Next slide, please. So if I can, for the next few minutes, I just want to talk about the economic impact that's been experienced both nationally and certainly within Toronto. Next slide. So national data published by the Bank of Canada tells us that the accommodation and the food sectors have been hit the hardest by the pandemic. And I don't think that comes as any surprise to anyone that's watching right now. We can see similar impacts for Toronto, where these sectors are significant parts of our urban economy. And that we know that there was a significant economic contraction and job losses during the severe closures in the spring of this year. The retail and accommodation food sectors were the most impacted, and each of those sectors contracted by about 100,000 jobs this past spring. We know that industries that experience the largest job losses also have the higher percentage of part-time and lower wage employees. As well, we know that those already in lower paid jobs were most likely to lose employment as a result of COVID-19. And yes, for those individuals, there was help that was provided by the federal government, and thankfully that was done and extended. But nonetheless, a number of people obviously have been directly impacted. And many of those people, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, were those that were precariously perched in our economy to begin with. Next slide. So with the reopening of parts of the economy after the initial shutdown, there's been obviously some bounce back, and this is what this diagram shows you in various sectors. And I won't highlight them all, but just to point out that yes, retail did respond, and a good portion of that response is actually related to the e-commerce. Yes, our educational sector and accommodations and food services and professional technical services all are heading in a better direction. But of course, you know, the question really is, what is the net effect of all of this? And that's, you know, that's the challenge that we face. So, you know, I would say that, you know, we're fortunate that employment has rebounded to some extent since the initial shocks of the spring. But there will still are sectors and people that continue to struggle, even with a return to more normal employment levels. You know, for example, you know, I mentioned it earlier, working from home affects, you know, a variety of industries that support many of our downtown, are supported by many of our downtown commuters. And the long-term labor market effects on youth and recent graduates remain to be seen. So we need to keep a focus on who has been impacted as we undertake our recovery and rebuild actions. Next slide. So this just shows you what that net effect is again. And so the retail, as I point out, information cultural industries and the professional scientific technical services and educational service, for the most part, the net effect has been positive. But you can see quite clearly that the net effect on others has not been. Next slide. So the changing workplace, I just want to point out some things. Interestingly, we're observing the rapid shift in how the professional components of the employment landscape are now working. As of February 2020, StatsCan reported 6.3% of the Ontario workforce was teleworking. By March 31st, 2020, this increased to 22.5%. And as of October of this year, StatsCan reports that 36.7% of the Ontario workforce was able to carry out the majority of their work via teleworking. That is a massive shift that no one could have predicted we could adapt so quickly to, including our own government. So with increased telework, we have seen decreased transit usage. For example, TTC ridership was down by 15 to 20% during the early lockdown measures. And as of September of this year, was back up to only about 35 to 40% compared to its pre-pandemic levels. While the TTC was ramping up to anticipate 50% ridership this fall, we know that additional public health restrictions will impact this, as we're experiencing now. As our downtown emptied out, with the knowledge workers in finance and professional sectors who dominate our office towers are now working at home, we have seen a rise in commercial vacancies in the downtown from 4.7% downtown to 4.7% from as low as 2.7% earlier this year. And we continue to see the significant impact on all of the supportive retail and food services business downtown, both in above ground and below ground, and we used to serve all of those downtown offices each day. So anyone that's been on the path in the last couple of weeks will know exactly what I'm talking about. And so I will say this, that our concerns related to our downtown, and for that matter, our main streets, are shared with the 5 other major municipalities that we're working with across Canada. So that's Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, Ottawa, and Montreal. Equally concerned about the effect that teleworking is going to have, and then what will become of those businesses that that don't have enough people frequenting them. And we're seeing it happen already. Many of them are closing down. You know, with the shift to teleworking, we're hearing more about people wanting more space to work at home. Rents are decreasing for the small one-bedroom apartments in the downtown core, and that segment of the retail estate market shows signs of softening. So these will all have ramifications on our recovery over not just the next few months, but I would argue for the next few years. So with that, if we can go to the next slide. I just want to talk about the deepening inequities. And again, you know, these are issues or challenges that I think we all knew existed before COVID. Really what we're seeing now is just the sheer magnitude of those that are impacted. And so with that, you know, the next few slides are going to focus on just what that impact looks like. So the Toronto Foundation's recently released Fallout report makes clear who's being most impacted by these shifts in our economy and the way of working. Some of their findings that stood out for me, and I know city staff are also observing on the ground through our services that we deliver, include, as we see here, youth unemployment has tripled and remains persistently high for BIPOC youth. Workers earning the lowest wages in Toronto saw their hours decrease by more than the rest of the country. Toronto had the highest unemployment rate in the country in September, and this is based on a 3-month average. And of course, job losses have been concentrated amongst women, and women with children are not recovering their hours, even as many other workers are getting back to work. And BIPOC Canadians have unemployment rates almost twice that is as those of white Canadians. Next slide, please. Again, these economic impacts build upon the health impacts where COVID-19 is directly impacting groups, some groups more than others. So what this graph shows is that the incidence of COVID-19 is higher for Black, South Asian, Latin American, Arab, Middle Eastern, West Asian communities compared to the share of Toronto's population. We also know that the northwest end of the city is hard hit by COVID, and we know similar matters are happening in the Scarborough area as well. The pandemic has put a spotlight on many challenges, and the fact is, even before the pandemic, not all Torontonians were benefiting from a strong economy and stable conditions that promote prosperity. As we move forward, our decisions need to address systemic challenges and challenge us to create opportunity, prosperity, and a better Toronto for all. More specifically, Council has made clear we need to focus on our economic and social infrastructure so people are supported in what they need. We must keep the city afloat and people supported while we work our way through this crisis. And certainly we're going to see that happening, as I know the vaccine, as it starts to find its way to Toronto and we're able to implement it, that we're going to see still these issues are not going to end abruptly. We see them extending into the future. So we must do better. We must do far better to respond to COVID in racialized communities and recognize the long-standing harms of anti-Black and Indigenous racism and other forms of systemic discrimination to inform our actions for a successful pandemic recovery in Toronto. Next slide, please. So we know that transformation is required to adequately address the inequities our residents face. Some impact we can see growing month to month. For example, increased food bank usage and more food insecurity. Inquiries into 211 has shown increases on this topic every month since March. As well, mental health support. This is a consistent finding across the region in terms of inquiries into 211 and what we heard through the TOR consultations, which I'll talk about in the next few minutes. When you overlay this with findings from the Fallout report, and we see a higher level of anxiety and concern about meeting financial obligations amongst people of color. While the city has consistently focused on advancing how we respond to equity and reconciliation through our actions of our confronting through the actions of our confronting anti-Black racism unit, the Indigenous Affairs Office, and our own equity, diversity, human rights team. But more specifically, what we're doing is we need to advance the following. First, we are advancing an equity responsive budgeting process where staff include an analysis of the equity impacts of proposed changes in the staff recommended tax supported operating budget to support informed decisions making by both public services and political leadership. So it's important that when we show not just the services we deliver and the investments in those services, we must demonstrate how they affect those that are most vulnerable right now and are likely to remain vulnerable in the future if we are to do something meaningful in terms of equity. A data for equity strategy, which was just actually approved, the resources for it were approved at committee this week, which is a citywide framework to ensure that socio-democratic data is collected and used appropriately to help the city meet the needs of diverse residents. Again, evidence-based decision-making, which we're all familiar with. Obviously, we must begin and make sure that we have the evidence in order to focus our energies and efforts. And then, of course, we have an automated equity lens tool, which empowers city staff with the opportunity to conduct an equity analysis to enable them to identify and address barriers facing marginalized communities, ensuring their needs are reflected in the city's policy, services, and programs. So these tools will help us make decisions across a number of areas, which some of the critical ones are shown on this slide. And by way of example, and I'm not going to list them all, housing, transit, food access, employment supports, etc. Next slide. So I'm going to focus now on the recovery that we are looking at. I mean, we keep hearing this term build back better, which of course begs the question, what do we mean by better? So I just want to spend a little bit of time explaining what we've been doing in terms of this more, if you will, the short, medium, and long-term efforts that I think are going to be needed. Next slide. So those that have been following what City Hall's been doing, we had created in April of this year a Toronto Office of Recovery and Rebuild, which was headed up by Dr. Mowat, former medical officer of health here in Ontario, and deputy or associate medical officer of health for Canada, and was also former MOH for Peel, together with Saad Rafi, who is a deputy minister of the province for over 10 years. The two of those individuals helped us work together with staff, but more importantly, helped us engage with our community on the matters that were concerning them most. And out of that came a report, a rather lengthy report in excess of 230 pages that gave us a number of recommendations, in fact, 83 in total. Those 83 recommendations were focused in the areas of public health, social determinants of health, which of course people know relates to matters such as housing, food security, income, education, etc. Also talked very specifically about increasing prosperity, and by prosperity for all. More focus being on individuals and populations within our community that are not enjoying the benefits of one of the most robust economies in North America over the last decade or more. So, but there's some very specific recommendations in the report regarding what needs to be done in terms of making sure everyone thrives. And of course, infrastructure and mobility. It speaks to what's happening with respect to everything from transit to other forms of active transportation, and infrastructure as it relates certainly to the next topic of resilience and climate action. We're so focused on COVID right now. It's not as if the matter of global warming and climate action has gone away. In fact, it's one of those crises that is becoming more and more pronounced as each day goes by. And then the last point that was touched upon in his report was really about the services that the City of Toronto provides and how we've been transitioning those services through the work that Josie Scioli is doing for us to modernize how Toronto provides what it provides to citizens. And so looking more to the private sector as to how it meets the needs of its clients, we're looking to transition the way that we deliver our services in a more digital format. So that was what the Office of Recovery and Rebuild wrote about, and that document that you see on the right in blue speaks to everything I just talked about. My report, which was submitted in October, spoke to how we achieve what is in this document that the TOR office created. So it really spoke to the approach that is going to be necessary in order to address not just these 6 theme areas and the 83 recommendations, but in terms of how it is that we would be we'd be able to kind of strategize around a short, medium, long-term recovery effort. So it really spoke to the matter of a whole of government approach, and for that matter, the whole of community approach. And my background is planning. My approach to most things is very much interest-based. So I think it's going to be important that certainly the interests of Toronto, but equally important, the interests of the other levels of government, as well as our neighbors, needs to be understood before we start to really figure out how best to move forward. And so that's really what my report spoke to, is about government relations in a way in which we haven't done them before. It is about an engagement effort with our community that will be and has to be, I think, building on what we've done in the past, but maybe accelerate it in many ways to make sure that people in this community, interest groups in this community, are more in tune with the direction that we need to go in. And so, transparency, I think, is going to be vitally important in the way in which we move forward and how we succeed in addressing these challenges. Next slide. So with that, I do want to talk about our prosperity. And so we must consider how we define prosperity and what it will take for us to get back to growth in our GDP and our region's contributions once again. The latest GDP forecast for the Toronto CMA from Conference Board of Canada and Moody's Analytics and Oxford Economics predict that Toronto's economy will contract by 4.5% in 2020 before rebounding by 6.3% next year. We know that annual GDP growth averaged about 2.8% over the last 10 years. The rebound will be essential. In the longer run, however, we have to focus on strengthening our economy by growing our labor force and ensuring that we can maximize the contributions of all Canadians. And let me stress, all Canadians. Many have called for a focus on reducing barriers for women to participate in the labor market, and the federal government renewed commitment to a national childcare program, which we as municipalities welcome greatly. We must also focus on those with disabilities and those who are underemployed, such as youth and newcomers, and support their contributions to the economy. And so we must continue to focus on immigration as a key way to meet our labor market needs, which means ensuring immigrants can contribute their skills and capacity to the fullest extent possible. Deloitte Canada has called for a focus on people, industry, and societal systems for Canada to thrive by 2030. They estimate that we could increase our labor force by about 1.7 million workers by eliminating barriers facing underrepresented groups looking to enter or advance in the workplace. All governments must consider these inputs and accelerate actions where we can make gains to account for COVID-19 impact on women and racialized and Indigenous communities with the longer view in mind. So prosperity should be defined by equity, resilience, and increased well-being. If we think about it in those terms, where prosperity in the past may very well have been the rich get richer and the rest don't. And we saw what was happening to our middle class, and we saw that our labor market was becoming more and more precarious, and the future generations, their ability to enter into the workforce becoming more and more challenging. I would suggest that prosperity maybe take on a new definition, and that definition, as I just said, be underscored by equity, resilience, and with resilience in my mind is climate action, and of course, increased well-being. Next slide. This is closer to home. This, I was mentioning earlier, the challenges that we've experienced at the city. In 2020, when we first saw COVID unfolding, we had indicated to council, and for that matter to the FCM, that the early numbers were telling us that it was going to be somewhere between $1.5 and about $3 billion was our early estimate. The number is now more in the range of for 2020. And when I say 1.7 billion, I am talking about revenues that we have not realized and expenses that we've incurred. So the 1.7 billion is the figure that more accurately represents the challenge that we faced in 2020. Keep in mind, our operating budget is worth about 11 billion. So this is under 20% of our budget, which again, compared to every other municipality in Canada, no one comes close to this challenge. And certainly the city strategies, because we knew going in that if we didn't come to the table with real effort to try and mitigate that cost, we would not be taken seriously by the federal and provincial government. And so in 2020, we were able to, through slowing down employment, through a number of other measures, put on the table $533 million. Safe Start Agreement initial funding has come in at around $668 million. So we have a year-end gap of just about $500,000, which, there is, as you can imagine, between the mayor's office and the work that my senior leadership team is doing with our counterparts. We still have a gap, but we do have confidence that that gap is going to be addressed. And so we greatly appreciate the Safe Start program. And so we are looking to square the 2020 budget. But again, I want to point out in 2021, the pressure is in the order of about $1.7 billion, which is what Janet said at the outset. And so, yes, again, we have to have strategies to demonstrate how the city will contribute to that figure, but also, are expecting that we will have support coming again from the federal and provincial government. I mean, these numbers are unprecedented, as you can imagine, and it doesn't end in 2021. Again, as COVID may find a vaccine that we are able to implement, the effect on the economy, we believe, is going to persist for some time. So we do project past 2021 that revenues will still be impacted and expenses will still be incurred. And so really the magnitude of this financial challenge is quite significant, not just this year and next year, but we believe on into the future. So again, it's not like it was before where, maybe simple increases in property tax that some might argue was right or wrong is going to somehow solve this challenge. That's not going to happen. Next slide. Again, if not now, when? I think, the matter of equity is facing us, and the challenge is growing significantly. So, when we look at, cities, the way that they were designed and how they've been financed, they were designed for another era. And so what may have worked for, over 100 years really begs the question in light of today's crisis, is that really the model you want going forward? And so COVID, in some respects, is really going to focus all of our attention right now on what we deliver in the way of services, how we support the federal and provincial government in their service aspirations, and how is it that we're able to pay for everything. I mean, when you look at Toronto's role in the local, regional, national economy, we are a major city. I mean, we are one of the largest in North America, and so it only stands to reason that Toronto, would take a leadership role, as our council has, and our mayor every week meets with his counterparts in the GTHA, certainly to focus on COVID and the response to the virus, but over time, our way forward in terms of addressing some of these equity issues and the bigger financial issues that we're facing, it is causing us to work in ways in which we haven't in the past. And so, given the magnitude of our challenge, if not now, when? And so this is why, what I've recommended in the report, that governments need to collaborate on these socioeconomic challenges. And we need to come together to figure out exactly how it is that we're going to recover. Next slide. So, I mean, we can't do it alone. For the last several months have demonstrated that governments can effectively work together. I have committed to bringing forward a renewed intergovernmental strategy for Toronto, and have already initiated dialogue with the federal government, provincial and regional officials, as well as other cities across the country, to convene a strategic federal, provincial, municipal intergovernmental table on recovery and renewal, to take a whole of government approach to addressing the challenges of COVID-19 pandemic and social determinants of health. Working with our partners is so critically essential. This includes, of course, community, private businesses, and institutions across all sectors. This cannot be a traditional response, as I hope I've convinced you. New networks and relationships need to be formed. We all need to lean in to build a shared agenda and work plan with critical milestones and results. We must use our precious resources for obviously the greatest positive impact and clear results. We can deliver more together than alone. As I've said many, many times, we're better together. And this is being reinforced by many of our partners in the reports, and including the Federation of Canada Municipalities and the Toronto Regional Board of Trade. For example, this is what we can do together. We can certainly develop a coordinated strategy on recovery and can focus on the economy and our most vulnerable communities and investments in social determinants of health. And certainly evidence of this was just done recently at the city. We have an MOU with the University Health Network, and in the Parkdale area, the University Health Network and the city, along with United Way, are developing a model for social housing that you've not seen in this country. They are sharing their property. We're sharing our expertise in terms of development, and we're going to leverage technology in ways in which we haven't in the past when it comes to healthcare. You know, when you look at the hospital system, and of all the people that frequent it, 10% of that population are responsible for 80% of the services that are consumed. So having a relationship with UHN, I think, is incredibly important. And so, you know, to begin working more effectively together across governments, institutions, and partners, we need first an agreement on shared priorities and objectives for recovery. Secondly, we need better ways to work together. Thirdly, we have to value relationships. And then, of course, you know, lastly, strong political leadership and commitment. If I can go to the next slide, please. So from a regional perspective, nearly 2/3 of the province's GDP and a quarter of the country's is generated by this region. The region is made up of interconnected municipalities, each with unique priorities, including housing, public transit, economic development, digital, and broadband. These municipalities invest in themselves along the way, advocating for funding from provincial and federal governments. There is really right now an opportunity to work together to leverage joint and shared outcomes regionally in scope and response to and recovering from COVID related economic impacts. So I want to, you know, obviously recognize recent reports from the Toronto Region Board of Trade entitled A Playbook for Rebooting and Reimagining the Regional Economy, Ontario's Innovation Corridor, and the Institute of Municipal Governance, A Playbook for Voluntary Regional Governance in Greater Toronto. These are examples, I think, that underscore the importance of the regional coordination for dealing with issues that don't stop at municipal boundaries. A regional approach for Toronto means integrating a regional approach within the city's renewed intergovernmental strategy with a focus on concrete outcomes for recovery and renewal. Really, I think it's an opportunity to identify opportunities for joint advocacy, program development, and targeted engagement with the provincial and federal government on issues not identified through other forums. Throughout the pandemic, there's been unparalleled cooperation at a political level, as I mentioned earlier, through the GTHA mayors and chairs, which has met more or less every week since April, and staff to plan and undertake coordinated advocacy and actions. So it's clear that we all face the challenge in economic renewal and recovery and supporting our residents who are most impacted by COVID. And I think key to our regional success will be leveraging our strong working relationships with strategic partners such as Toronto Region Board of Trade, building formal and trust relationship amongst regional municipalities with a focus on shared outcomes and alignment, leveraging provincial federal opportunities for regional approaches. Fundamentally, I think we're better together. Last slide. I just want to say this. You know, when the doom and gloom that comes with a worldwide pandemic, and very understandably, you know, the mental health and addiction issues that have been rising, the inequities that have been rising, you know, I always have to think in terms of, you know, the context that we're all in. You know, we're Canadians at the end of the day. I almost take for granted the fact that we have good government institutions. We have good education systems. We have good healthcare systems. We have good financial systems. We have a banking industry that is the envy of the world. So that's the context that we start with. And yes, we will complain about, you know, how certain things are done and whether done well enough. But at the end of the day, you know, I would have to think that for those that are looking for a place to live, when all of this gets sorted out, you know, we're starting with a wonderful context to begin with. And so I think it is time now that we, as institutions, whether we're government or education or otherwise, that we do spend our time to think about what prosperity should mean. And if it is to mean that we're going to address the inequities that we know persisted before but are now been magnified, if we believe that climate action and resilience is critical, and if as well we think that well-being is important, whether it be mental, physical, or otherwise, I would say right now is really as good a time as any for us to, you know, have a strategy that is, you know, built upon not one person's interest, but this collective interest. So with that, I appreciate you listening, and I will turn the floor back over to Jan.
Okay. Thanks so much, Chris. I've got audio. If I could get the host to turn back on my video, please.
Okay, I can't hear you, Jan.
Jan, you need to unmute.
There we go.
Sorry, some of my best work is done on mute. I do apologize for that. I was trying to get my video and everything else going. Chris, I just wanted to say, I mean, I think Enid, all the events I've been attending at IMFG and the important work that you're doing, Chris just highlighted the need to solve for this in spades. I mean, what COVID has done is totally exacerbated this long-term mismatch between revenues and responsibilities. And this is not just simply a math exercise. I mean, I think, Chris, some of the most telling slides you had were about the disproportionate impact this is having to members of our community. So really critical that we move this forward. We're going to move into some Q&A with Chris. If you've got questions, and I encourage you to submit your questions, do so through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I've got a few that I'll start with now just to kickstart the discussion. Chris, you've laid out some really good points about the importance about a whole of government's approach. And certainly since the beginning of this pandemic, we've seen really strong collaboration happening at all three levels. Now, with the need for Toronto to walk in step with the province and the federal government, as well as municipal partners in the region, what is that going to look like for us to successfully do that? And if some of the other orders of government don't come to the table with new decision-making and funding tools, how can we take our own leadership role in this region?
Well, I'm going to answer it two ways. I mean, first, when when COVID struck, we had reached out to the other major cities in the country just to get a sense of what their financial challenge was, but how they were seeing COVID unfold in their communities, like what were the socioeconomic and cultural effects of it. So collectively, we established a series of about 5 themes that we all knew we shared an interest in. And we had then reached out to the federal government to see whether or not they would want to talk to us about these interests. So, and matters such as, you know, the mental health and addictions issues that plague all of us, matters such as the digital divide, matters such as our downtowns and our main streets and how they've been affected. You know, certainly transit was a massive topic for all of us. What makes Toronto different is that the fact that we have a subway system where others don't, so the impact was even greater for us. So we came together, and we continue to be together. In fact, our effort is coordinated by the Canadian Urban Institute right now. And so we took the view that we would see whether or not we could have influence over FCM and maybe even the federal government. And so there have been a number of meetings on the topics that I just mentioned that is showing some real interest from the federal government in terms of you know, what new policies or programs might be contemplated in order to address some of these inequities. The other was just around the GTHA. And I mean, I'm fortunate that I came from Hamilton, and I'll be honest, you know, Toronto was always that center of the universe, and the rest of us were just mere satellites. And so, you know, when I was offered this job, you know, I realized, wait a minute, now I'm that I'm that center of the municipal universe. And so my approach has always been to worry less about, the magnitude of Toronto, and we all know how important it is, but to, want to understand what are the issues that my colleagues in other municipalities are experiencing. And the topics that your organization, Jan, has been working on with us, again, transit, housing, the digital divide, how we might be able to approach procurement in a more effective way. These are all things that you share, along with how businesses are going to be supported throughout all of this and prosper at the end. These are all themes that we now are talking about amongst ourselves as municipalities. And thankfully, we have the interests of the federal government. So I don't really see at this point that there won't be a receptivity to municipalities talking to the province or the feds. I believe that there will be a lot of interest in what our concerns are. How we go about that discussion, as I said earlier, I'm an interest-based style civil servant. I know when I look at the throne speech, when I look at the policies and programs that have been announced from the federal and provincial government, which obviously we track, there's a lot of alignment between what we're talking about and what they want to talk about. Sorting out the actions now will be the challenge. So, I don't really see it at this point as Toronto having to go it alone or anything of that nature. I think it's too early. There's too much uncertainty that all of us share. And, we really need to make sure that as we kind of generate our facts, we don't generate them in isolation of each other, that collectively we should be generating information that informs the collective decisions that need to be made. So I think it's still early days. If it doesn't work, I report back to council every quarter on the nature of the progress that we're making with the federal and provincial government and other municipalities. And that's where the politicians, I think, can be incredibly helpful in terms of making sure that our issues are taken seriously. So it's really now, I think, that we have that chance to have conversations like we haven't had in the past.
Well, and I think something that's been incredibly powerful that you've initiated across the GTHA is starting to harmonize how everyone tracks revenues, expenses, and so that we've got a common set of accounts, rather, to have discussions with the province and the feds. And any of those discussions ultimately has to go beyond just the short-term budget shortfall that we have. The issue has to be really a renegotiation of funding. So if you faced no constraints, how would you reimagine Toronto's revenue and funding streams?
Well, we've talked about in the past, a percentage of sales taxes, and honestly, as I look at the e-commerce and that's a path that we're on that's not going to slow down. We're going to be shopping digitally for some time now that we've all learned how to do it. And even I've learned how to do it. And I still, as an urban planner, I still subscribe to Jane Jacobs and the fact that I think people still want to be with people. I don't think we're going to do everything online, and I don't think we're going to all just stay home and work out of our basements like I'm doing right now. I think at the end of the day, that human interaction, once we get over COVID, and we get back to being able to manage these kinds of matters, we will want to be with each other. So I believe that fundamentally, and I think it will mean that the spaces in which we occupy together need to be even more interesting. And so I look at that in terms of, but the e-commerce. Our traditional tax base is, as we know, is property tax, and if those businesses that used to employ me, I used to go to work in those businesses, are gone because they're now in the cloud. How do we participate in that economy? What are we getting from, except for the trucks or the vehicles that travel on our roads and wear them down? Yeah, we might get the odd distribution system, but at the end of the day, it runs the risk of impacting our retail sector hugely, and with that will come property tax consequences. So that's a major challenge. And then the whole matter of teleworking and what effect that's going to have on office space demand, and how that's going to affect those businesses that need those people buying their their restaurant goods or their other goods. I mean, this is all pointing us into a direction, and I want to be careful before I pound my fist on the table and demand these things. I really want to understand what the federal and provincial government is thinking along these lines about, how do we redress that loss of property tax potentially from that sector of our economy being negatively affected from my perspective. So, it's that's a question that they will be asked, and I'm very much looking forward to how it is that together we might be able to solve that. I mean, there's other tools, of course, there's gas tax, which is a very useful revenue source for us. I look at that. I mean, you could easily argue it could be greater. And again, if we're going to fund the kind of transit system that we need regionally, I could see that being quite helpful. But again, we're shifting to more electric over time, and so that's a bit of a precarious source. There's other tools that we have within the Toronto Act, some of which we control entirely, some of them we don't. Easily make the argument that the tools that we have right now ought to be extended to the municipalities that we're all working with. I think that would make a lot of sense. I saw Vancouver now is going to be taxing people coming into its downtown. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I'd want to do that while I'm trying to build back a downtown economy to discourage people from maybe coming into that downtown because of greater taxes. I worry about that a bit. And there's, but that's the revenue side. Don't forget the expense side. How we, why are we assuming that, that, for example, transit needs to be kept on Toronto's books forever and a day? Mm-hmm. Jan, this as well as I do. I mean, when I first joined here, I thought the state of good repair for transit was about $6.5 billion. Rick Leary then informed me it was $33.5 billion. I mean, that's breathtaking. Our capital program is worth about $40 billion over 10 years. $33.5 billion is what needs to be invested in the next 15 years. And the mayor and council rightfully increased taxes to start to address that. So, and we have expansion programs in transit that the province is supporting here in Toronto. And quite frankly, it's almost, we can't build enough transit to be, and I would think now is a great time to be building as much transit as we can, because again, you got to look at transit as one of the ways in which you can address inequities. How you connect where people live to where they need to get to, to work and to, to enjoy basics of life. I mean, just as broadband, and I think everyone thinks broadband is a rural issue. We have deserts within this city that require broadband investment. So how are we going to pay for that? I mean, that's something that supports the economy of Southern Ontario as well as the country. Again, I don't want to get ahead of myself in terms of these conversations with the feds and the province, but all of us know that, we know what our work is. We have a good idea of what we got to do. And on the housing front, I mean, I just, when my wife and I first moved to Toronto, I mean, I don't really, and I went to Ryerson, I don't recall seeing as much homelessness on the street as I saw. I mean, if that doesn't bother all of us, there's something fundamentally wrong. And I think Deloitte in their report and saying that, if we want all of the people that live in this country to have an opportunity to participate in the economy, then the fundamentals around housing, the view of housing as a right, absolutely. I mean, we need to make sure that, the housing is available. I know Toronto Council is investing heavily in it, and so is the federal government. But with that, and I used to be the CEO of Hamilton City Housing, I knew that the bricks and mortar was only one part of the story. The other part of the story is the mental health and addiction issues that, the other supports that people need. So, the social housing model needs to be advanced. So I apologize and go on for a while on this, but
no. But I think what you're indicating, it's a deep, complex issue. It's not just a single silver bullet of solutions. You open the door for something that the board has spent a lot of time, which is kind of the potential of an integrated service model for transit. I'm not going to go there right now. I wanted to go somewhere else because you also spoke about homelessness, and that is that's been exacerbated through this pandemic. And in fact, one of the first questions we've gotten in from the audience today is related to that. And the question is specifically, we see city staff working so hard to house homeless people, but it seems impossible to gain ground. Can you describe how a regional approach might help turn Toronto's homeless crisis around?
Well, I mean, you know, as a planner, as someone that's worked in transportation planning, and as well in housing, to me, transit and housing are linked. You know, we have an opportunity as we plan out our transit system, and when we look at all the stations that are going to be built along the way, we have an opportunity to intensify, you know, residential development. And when we talk about residential development, you have to plan that development to have all levels of income together. You know, it's kind of like the Regent Park model, where there was an introduction of that mixed income, that mixed socioeconomic, you know, population. I mean, the evidence is pretty overwhelming around the world when you look at how it is you plan for these communities that you're building and supporting. And so, you know, you have a tremendous opportunity to, you know, to do two things really in a planful way. And that is, you know, unfortunately, I will keep coming back to the transit on it as a regional concept, because, you know, what we're learning about work has become less place-based and more of a service. And so, you know, people are going to be able to work from various locations. You know, Toronto and the Toronto region is, and will be, you know, a center for people in this country and around the world to come to. And solutions to housing is so fundamental to the economy and success of this region that, you know, it has to be seen as, you know, more than maybe a right. It has to be seen as a critical investment. And again, I go back to bricks and mortar is important. Diverse socioeconomic neighborhoods are important, but access to the services to help people that experience the kinds of stresses that people do when they sometimes live in poverty or are marginalized, I think that has to be integrated into it. And to your, this is a system. And I got to tell you, when I look at how we plan communities, you know, as an urban planner, and if you look at medical science over the last few hundred years, look what we've learned over the last few hundred years in terms of how this system that we have works, you know, how all of our organs are connected, and how, you know, the study of the research into things like brain development, how that's evolved. I mean, we recognize, certainly from a medical standpoint, that these bodies we walk around are elaborate, complex systems. But somehow we don't seem to understand our communities are just as complex, that they are systems. It's almost like we're just trying to catch up now and recognize that, you know, cities and city regions are elaborate, complex systems. And the fact that we weren't really talking to each other and planning together and working together to joint problem solve, you know, that's not a systems approach. And I think what we're talking about with your organization and the institutions that I've mentioned earlier is to take more of a systems approach and ask yourself, what are the outcomes that we want to see occur in that system, and how can we achieve those outcomes?
Well, so let's just explore this a little bit further. I mean, is it finally time to think about transit-oriented communities, which is the complete system around transit and jobs located in close vicinity, or easy access to jobs? But is it finally time to integrate fares and service and transit-oriented communities into a regional model?
No question.
What are the biggest barriers to making it happen? I mean, clearly with the revenue burden that the city is facing right now with TTC, the state of good repair backlog, yes, which is a staggering number. What are our biggest barriers to making this happen? Pre-COVID, there was a huge sense of ownership of TTC attached to the community, but what do you think it would take to really make this happen?
Well, I mean, that if you take service and fare integration, I mean, first of all, you have 11 transit authorities within this region. When's the last time you've seen 11 people come to agreement on lunch, let alone anything as complicated as transit? So the fact is that as long as we want to perpetuate this, these islands of transit service, within the region, it's going to be awfully hard because each one of them has a responsibility, except for Toronto, to a council. So it's easy to operate as independent agents, not hard at all. And then you have the provincial government, through Metrolinx, that is, very much in an expansion mode in terms of investments and infrastructure. But I got to tell you, like, I applaud when you read the Safe Start directive coming from the province. I mean, it makes explicit mention in terms of leveraging its revenue dollars to the GTHA. And the conversation we're going to have with the federal government, I think you're going to see more and more interest in them, in us coming together as a region and proposing, a system of transit. And it's nothing new. I mean, Enid chaired a group that I had asked as part of the terms of reference for the subway download exercise to look at, what have the advances that have been made in regional transit planning. And that group gave us their advice, which anyone can get online. But what we're talking about, really should have been done a long time ago. But you look at Montreal, you look at Vancouver, you look at all the major cities in North America, around the world. These are regional transit systems. It's not like we're inventing anything new here. It's just get on with it, but figure out the governance, because quite honestly, when someone's bus doesn't show up, they're going to call their elected official municipally, right? They're not going to call their MPP or MP. So whatever the governance model has to be, it's got to be connected to the municipal decision maker. And it can't be, all due respect to my colleagues, a board of just a bunch of administrators making, just strictly, efficiency and financial decisions. I mean, we could do that. But I think that connection into the elected official municipally, that kind of governance approach is going to be really important. But, as long as there's will, and I know the city of Toronto had given me some direction to go have a look at this, and the province had agreed that we should look at this, I think now is really the time to ask yourself the question, how might we evolve that system? And with that, look at exactly what you're talking about, transit-oriented design of neighborhoods. And so leverage those massive investments we're making and build out neighborhoods that can take full advantage of this integrated system of transit service.
Yeah. Question now from Joe Barrage. Joe is reflecting on the fact Toronto is by far the wealthiest region in Canada. Shouldn't we be taxing ourselves to reinvest? Would a regional 1% sales tax act as the glue for the creation of urban region governance?
And I think if we're going to do that, people want to know very specifically, what is that money going to? And if it goes into the general coffers, I don't think there's political hope. If it's targeted towards things that people absolutely understand and get, that needs to be invested in, no different than what the city of Toronto did in this year's budget. I mean, the investment in really state of good repair infrastructure, specifically, transit and housing. I think that's why Mayor Tory and members of council agreed unanimously to do that. You can't just, propose such a revenue source and not have it tailored specifically to a problem you need to address, and then report regularly as to whether or not that investment is fixing the problem that it was intended to fix. So I think that time is come. But it does boil down to being given the authority to have that tool in our arsenal with the conditions I just mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Well, interesting question as well from the audience. And I'm just going to say, in the old world before COVID, when we used to be able to do business delegations with the mayor, I remember the mayor of the city of Shanghai, China, had asked the mayor this question. And the question really is, because of Toronto's importance to the province and to the country, shouldn't there be a constitutional change where Toronto has a different status? So do you think that changes to Toronto's constitutional status could impact the city's relationship with the province and the federal government? And if so, would this be a positive thing for intergovernmental relations overall?
I mean, honestly, and I have no problem answering that question. I don't want to dodge it. I just think by the time that decision gets made, we will be so deep into a socioeconomic problem that if that's what comes out of it down the road, that would not be the first thing I would want to accomplish. I want to talk about the inequities that people are experiencing. I want to talk about transit. I want to talk about housing. I want to talk about how we support people. I would much rather talk about a basic income than talk about Toronto having special status. And so, sure, and there are those that are going to advocate for it, and there will be some merit certainly to it, but it's about, picking your battles. And that's not one that I would recommend to council. Now, mind you, in a couple of years, we do get a chance to have a look at the Toronto Act. And I guarantee you over the next several months, there'll be things that will surface that probably would make some sense in terms of them being included or it being included in the Toronto Act. I'm not discounting the importance of Toronto at all. I mean, as a city manager, I have a good idea what my responsibilities are. There are just certain battles that I don't know if they are right to have right now. If elected bodies feel that it should be, then we'll go chase it. But I mean, that wouldn't be my first recommendation.
No, I hear you. But I'll follow on to this. It's really trying to unpack why Toronto's situation is so much more fiscally suffocated. And so the question really is, how do the city's budget impacts related to COVID compare to other municipalities? For example, possibly on a per household basis. What are some special factors in addition to transit costs affecting Toronto that might account for impacts being so high in Toronto compared to other municipalities?
I mean, there was a time where, and again, it was based on property tax that, the other, excluding Hamilton, the other 905 municipalities were contributing to the housing challenges that we had. So, Toronto has got, from a shelter system perspective, I mean, nothing compares to the size of our system. And so, you ask the question, well, why do we have such a large system? Well, we have tremendous services in Toronto. We have the country's top medical services, hospitals in this city, along with, a very large not-for-profit, service providers as well. So we are going to attract a number of people to this community. But I think the idea that the Toronto property tax should be paying for, the lion's share of this is really a flawed approach. So, I go back to, we're almost 3 million people. The broader region, GTHA, is approaching 7 million people. We're supposed to grow by, another million plus in the next 20 years. You look at Toronto over the last 10 years, we grew by a Burlington and Oakville. We added that many people. And so, and a lot of the people that are coming here are just looking to get their start in life. And so those are services that we provide on our taxpayers, bottom dollar, to help those people, become successful. Some of them stay, some of them move on within the region and beyond. So, I don't think it's that hard to understand why the Toronto taxpayer may take some issue with why it is that they're paying for services that really don't lend themselves to property tax revenues. And they provide a broader good for not just Toronto, but for the region and, for that matter, the province and the country. So, I mean, we pushed back on the refugee costs. I mean, you'll know the first year that Heather Taylor and I, in working on the budget, we identified a $45 million gap that we felt the federal government should pay, and they did. 2020, we have about a $75 million gap, which the federal government recognizes they need to pay. We just got to stop paying other people's bills, really. I mean, as much as I love going out and eating, I don't generally pick up the tab of someone beside me at their table. Maybe I should, I don't know, but none of us do that. So why are we paying for someone else's bill? And so, in council, obviously took our advice, and now we're looking at, the fact that Toronto is Toronto. I mean, a number of people are benefiting from that. So, I would say, we got to align the benefits and the costs, and not all those costs should be borne by us.
And I know you'd mentioned your predecessor, Peter Wallace, and as part of the city's long-term financial planning effort, he'd also proposed that a modest share of HST and other sources of income taxes generated in Toronto could create about $1.5 billion in new revenue for Toronto annually. That would seem to go a long way against the budget challenges that we're facing in the moment. Do you see progress being made? Is that still being discussed at the federal and provincial level?
I mean, it won't come as any great surprise, because, what Peter was advocating for, exact same opinions were coming from the other 5 municipalities that we're working with across the country. We haven't had, just because we say it doesn't make it so. Mm-hmm. So it's really about, the conversations that we need to have right now with the federal and provincial government. Just, it really kind of comes down to, what does a successful 416905 region mean to the province and to the country? When 25%, actually it's more than 25% of GDP is coming from this region, then strategic investments in this region will generate the kind of, economic activity that you want. We're just saying, in light of everything that we're seeing, that, all boats need to float, and that, it can't be, that not just those that are marginalized, that, that because of, systemic racism and other systemic issues, we need to take this seriously and look at them as being critical to our success. I mean, it's not just morally the right thing to do. I think in our long-term interests as a country, that we need to do a far better job addressing the problems of homelessness, of people with inadequate housing, with inadequate supports. And I would say, Jan, honestly, being at the table, even though we're not responsible for education, we know how important the education, industry, if you will, or the institution is in terms of, preparing people for that workforce. I mean, even though we don't control it, I can tell you, we probably have views about it, and we should be expecting that, the provincial and federal government take that just as seriously as some of the issues that we're bringing to the table. So this whole of government isn't just about us playing in our lanes. It is about, calling on other levels of government, to take a holistic approach to supporting this economy. And education is such an important part. And I mean, we haven't talked about our labor unions and the roles that they play in this. And, I mean, myself, I see tremendous value in the unions and the importance of unions. But what is their role at the table? How are they going to advocate? And so I think, we as a city, have a real interest in that.
So Chris, you talked about being the city manager of Hamilton and then moving to be the city manager of Toronto. So this will be our last question before I turn things back to Enid. And you've been a real catalyst for this one corridor working group of CAOs across the corridor that's coming together, that is looking to work on a harmonized basis to try to address affordable housing and transit and critically enabling infrastructure like broadband across the whole, and also tackle climate change, electric buses, those types of things. Yeah. How do you now, sitting in the city manager's role in Toronto, how are you able to bring everyone together, bring everyone to the table, being in the chair that's in the center of the universe, as you described when you were looking from the outside in Hamilton?
So I mean, first of all, I'm originally from New Brunswick, so I'm a Maritimer. And the thing about living and working in the Maritimes is that you take nothing for granted, because the economy isn't anything like the Golden Horseshoe economy in the Maritimes. So you work hard, and we were always, looking from the outside in. We always saw the Golden Horseshoe as just that, the Golden Horseshoe. And then you find yourself in the Golden Horseshoe as one of the players in that massive geographic, that regional economy. And you see the quality of life that people have experienced and actually could experience. And so, like, I don't know what it is. I mean, I've never played very well in the sandbox. I kind of always I've always looked at my responsibilities, but always wondered how my responsibilities connect to others. And it's just that approach. And, it's the things that, I've had a chance to be part of. And I never for a minute think that I'm going to solve it, because of course, that would be a head that is just too big to fit into any room. But what I love about it, the complexities and the unknowns, the uncertainties, is the people that are drawn to that kind of challenge. And it's amazing how many times, if you create the right environment, that people will define the problem and they will jointly solve the problem. And I've just seen that happen so often, that in terms of what's facing the golden horseshoe in the way of a challenge. And the fact that, as I concluded, I mean, as Canadians, we don't ever give ourselves enough credit. And that's not our style, but we do know how to come together. And I think this is one of those moments where, the major institutions, not just government, but I look at what your group does. I look at the universities and colleges. I look at the BIAs. I look at, I look at the civic action. I mean, I think my first presentation was all about intergenerational equity. I'm worried about my kids, the precarious employment, housing prices that they could never afford. I mean, their quality of life is going to be dramatically affected. It was before COVID, imagine now. So I sit here and I go, like, if I can be part of this, that's a privilege, and that's how I view it. And so it's trying to find those common interests and try to get them into the room and get ourselves to focus, be clear on what outcomes that we want to collectively achieve, make sure everyone at the table finds a way to win, and don't spend all day doing it, And I'll just end with this. I mean, as a bureaucrat, I don't wake up in the morning thinking, how slow can I go today? A lot of us have worked in the private sector, and we had these stereotype views of maybe government workers, and then we all came into the government world. And I swear to God, I work with some of the most, not just dedicated, but brilliant, hardworking, dedicated. And I don't say that just to rah them. I'm just telling you that is my honest experience. Yeah. And that's what makes this fun. And my colleagues, the CAOs and the city managers in the GTHA and beyond, they're just as privileged as I am to be in this moment in time. And we just want to do our best, because our parents, whether they're still living or not, they're watching us and they would expect us to do our best. So, and that's what we're here to do. So, and that's a privilege.
Well, thanks, Chris. I mean, as I turn things over to Enid, it's very, very clear we've got a lot of momentum happening in the corridor at a regional level among the CAOs. Huge credit to you, Chris, for bringing everyone to the table. I think it helps that you've had your toes in both parts of the corridor, so to speak. And I think that the answer to the question that's the title of this presentation, if not now, then when? I think it is now. And so we look forward to seeing and supporting you in your efforts to bring that forward. Enid, I'll turn things over to you. Thanks, Chris.
Sharon. Thanks.
Wow. My role now is really to thank Chris and Jan, but I have to say that was a very thoughtful and thought-provoking hour and a half that we've had together. Jan started by saying what the challenges are facing the region even before COVID. Challenges around transit and housing, affordable housing and inequities, and issues around climate change. And COVID has just exacerbated all of these challenges and created some others. But Chris, you talked about COVID being a catalyst for change. And I think that's important. We have a lot of great ideas out there of what to do. We've talked about regional transit. We've talked about affordable housing. We know what to do. And maybe this pandemic has given us the impetus to just go a little faster on some of these issues. I also think you're right that Toronto can't do it alone. And I think what is also, if there's an upside to this pandemic, has been the collaboration across the region, but with all orders of government and institutions, as you've talked about. And so if we can continue that collaboration, I think we can do a lot of good going forward. And Chris, with you there, making it happen, I know it's going to happen. So the other thing you said that I appreciated was that when we can, many of us are going to want to go back to our offices and go back to seeing people. We're basically very social. And so I'm hoping that next year, when you do the city manager's address, the 10th annual city manager's address, this is your invitation to be there. I hope we can do it in person and that you will join us. Jan, thank you for moderating. You've done a great job of getting the discussion going and working with questions from the audience. So that will be great. For all of you who attended, thanks for your questions. Today's event has been recorded, so there will be a video available on our website tomorrow or the next day. Please share it with your colleagues who couldn't attend. And lastly, just thank you everybody for a great event and have a wonderful evening.